Well, folks, we're back with another AMA with Hearthstone developer Iksar answering all your Hearthstone questions. And less news in this one, but some general insights and game design stuff and talking about the future of Hearthstone. So let's kick it off here with Ben Hearthstone's question. Go follow this guy on Twitter, by the way. He's like the best Hearthstone news source out there. Way better than yours truly. And he asked basically if we have future game modes coming, or what's the right number of game modes Hearthstone could have in 5 to 10 years. Iksar says, I can see us doing different formats within a game mode, but not many more totally different game modes. When we make new cards, all card formats benefit. Wild, Standard, Arena, Wild, Tools, etc. Having lots of different ways to play is great, but it creates a huge content pipeline for us. We spend so much time in upkeep that it's hard to spend time innovating new things. The next year or two in Hearthstone are likely to include system level improvements and improvements to existing game modes rather than new ones. Yeah, so essentially Iksar is saying every time they split the Hearthstone pie into a significantly different chunk, like Battlegrounds demands different card designs than Constructed. Of course, there are some that can cross over, but lately Battlegrounds is beginning dedicated designs. And it sounds like Mercenaries is going to demand its own sort of dedicated designs as well. Now, on the other hand, the more Constructed formats, you design one card, it's going into every single mode. So you're basically getting kind of like 5 times return on that card design. Whereas for Battlegrounds or Mercenaries, each design it's getting that 1x return. So it makes sense that you don't want to split across too many ways because you need different teams, more people, and it's just much harder to keep up with all those content demands if you want to satisfy the player bases of each of those given modes. So, they've talked about Hearthstone as a platform. Sounds like it does have limits. I like the idea, though, of going back in and refining and tweaking and making improvements. I think there's a lot of little things on a system level that each of these game modes could really benefit from. So I'm okay with this. Let's get a few nice engines running and then, maintain those engines and make sure they're running smoothly before we start adding in more and more stuff. Speaking of new stuff, this was a question about Mercenaries being advertised as a release that was supposed to come out a long time ago, and why it got delayed. And Iksar says we've delayed it multiple times. We meant for it to release sooner, but ran into some snags and scope increases we thought were necessary towards the end of development. So this is always intriguing. Like, I'd love to hear more about this, but we just don't know anything. That said, remember, we're getting a big Mercenaries reveal on Tuesday, August 31st. So just a couple days away. We'll hopefully know a lot more about Mercenaries. I think my guess, if I had to predict what I think has caused the delay in Mercenaries, is I think they wanted it to feel like a really new mode, and they wanted it to feel accessible from your first day in Hearthstone, particularly for a mobile audience. So I think they probably went in and maybe adjusted the tutorial or the new player introduction and the main menu to make it feel like Mercenaries and probably even Battlegrounds are a more core option to Hearthstone, and they're not kind of buried deep within the modes menu, because I think they probably want Mercenaries to be a mobile friendly mode where people can come in and play it right away. So that's my suspicion. It's less about the Mercenaries gameplay, probably. I'm sure that's been tweaked up to the final moment as well, but I think it's probably more about the wrapping and the menu and the tutorial and all those sorts of things that get people onto that Mercenaries train much sooner. Speaking of formats and game modes here, a question about adding new sets to Classic or, additional sets. So Naxxramas, Goblins versus Gnomes, etc. hitting the Classic line. And Iksar says we'll discuss it with the team. Not much of an update, but still on the table, still a possibility. Just wanted to point that out for anybody out there who's looking for Naxxramas to come to Classic. I suspect the player base there is really split. Some people probably really want the sort of symmetrical release calendar of the old Hearthstone, whereas some people probably want it to stay purely Classic. I don't know how much they can split that player base off, like True Classic, Classic Plus, or whatever. You might run out of players and people to queue into if you go too many ways. I really want just Naxxramas and I want up through the grand tournament. You can't split the player base that many ways, but I, for one, I think it'd be cool to come back in and see each expansion release environment as it existed back in the day. So that would get me to play it, but I also don't want to disrupt people who are really enjoying Classic for Classic. Hearthstone's going to have a pretty big decision to make there. This one's pretty crazy. How many expansions are the dev team ahead right now? And Iksar says we're currently in week 6 of design on the set that will release at the end of next year. So they're on the 2022 December-ish expansion release, and they're like a month and a half into it. So they are like well over a year ahead at this point when it comes to design. And I just wanted to bring that up as a point of discussion, essentially, for all of you in the comments down there. If you think that's great or bad, and now clearly it has, very important timeline implications. They need to be that far ahead to get voice work done and art done and all these sorts of things, because design really guides a lot of that. And, logos and marketing and just all this stuff has a really long pipeline that they need to make sure that the core of the expansion is there to set all that future stuff up, clearly. But I wonder if that has any negative implications on things like balance and how metas are designed around player experiences and feelings, and if those delays create issues. Now, I personally don't think they create huge problems, because there are initial designers who are working on that, and there are final designers who are currently keeping up with the current state of the meta, things like nerfs and more fine-tuning expansions that are about to come out. So I think there's still a good feel for what's happening in Hearthstone today. But you could see maybe some really large overarching trends that kind of get baked into an expansion based on an experience that people are having, a year out from what experience is happening when the expansion actually gets released. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this one. I thought it might make for some good talking down there in the comments. Ooh, I love this one. Can we ever see cards from the Titans, meaning the characters in Warcraft lore? We'll do a Titan set someday. We've almost done it a few times going back 6 to 7 years. The characters are too cool not to use. Ulduar is also amazing. So a couple teases here. It seems like maybe some sort of Ulduar themed set. Bringing in the Titans is something we might get. I think anytime there's a tease like this, it like kind of lends credence to it coming sooner rather than later. Like maybe it's already in the pipeline or something. That's obviously just a theory, speculation, but nonetheless, it has to be exciting. I would definitely love to see the Titans. We've done a few Titan custom cards throughout the years, and the designs for those are always so big and epic and awesome. So this is a welcome sight indeed for me. All right, so this is actually a pretty exciting question for people who like single player stuff. Joshua says, will we see any updates to the dungeon run style, solo adventures, new cards and buckets, bosses, treasures, etc.? Iksar says, probably not. Won't be getting new stuff in old dungeon runs, but we want to do single player content again someday. So if you see more dev effort on the dungeon run front, it'll probably be in the form of something new. And that's cool. I'm glad that that's at least a possibility. Certainly no confirmation here, but I feared that maybe duels was the kind of new dungeon run, and we might not get any additional dungeon run for single player content, which they're very different, right? They live in very different spaces in people's minds, and a ton of people are still playing the dungeon run style modes in Hearthstone, even though they're years old at this point. So giving them something fresh would be awesome. I really, really hope we get more dungeon runs. This is kind of a neat idea that could refresh Arena. The question is essentially, what kind of product would you like to make? A draft set, a 300 card set? Like, what kind of weird thing would you like to do? Iksar says, I'd love to make a special draft set for Arena, though I imagine it would be hard to justify its viability as a product. I've always wanted to make Arena draft cards that show up in your draft as options: a face down legendary. Your next 3 picks are Murlocs. Randomly delete 3 cards from your deck. Redraft your deck. Replace the last 3 cards you drafted with random legendaries. I think that's awesome. Arena has been so stale for so many people for so long, and doing things like this, adding an extra strategic layer, a little bit of controlled randomness, could be a real way to freshen up the mode. I don't know if this would be high or low overhead for Blizzard. It seems like a low-hanging fruit, but might be tougher than we imagine. But I think Arena needs something. It's been the same game mode. It only changes based on card rotations, and I'm not sure that's enough to really keep it fresh, because some of the most interesting designs and most exciting things in a given expansion don't work in Arena. So things like quest lines, for instance, just aren't a part of Arena. So it's even missing out on a lot of the fun new stuff that's naturally coming to Hearthstone. So all in all, this, I think, would go a really long way towards making that possible. He does admit mostly bad ideas off the top of my head, but just things that come up as you're drafting that make for interesting decisions. Frankly, duels could use some more of this manipulation style stuff as well, things like Bob's Tavern being introduced to duels like it is in dungeon runs would be a welcome sight. So I would love Blizzard to explore this space. A little bit of a conspiracy theory here. Do you ever pick your nerfs in regards to the dust rewards that may be given out to players? Iksar says it is irrelevant. The team that makes balanced decisions is completely separate from any of the teams that deal with in-game economy. And I love a good conspiracy theory, but I don't think this one tracks very well. If you just even look at the most recent nerfs, they nerfed like all epic cards almost. There's a bunch of epics. They probably could have nerfed other stuff that gave less dust rewards on the return. Clearly, certain cards, demand nerfs. I didn't double check, but it doesn't feel to me like there's a theme here where they're only nerfing stuff that's like commons, for instance, or printing overpowered cards at the common slot for later. So a fun theory, but unfortunately one I just don't think tracks, or perhaps fortunately one that doesn't track. All right, this one's frustrating for me personally. I know I think it'd be really good for the game. Ryan McElmore asked, the implementation of the random card back's been one of my favorite features. Agreed. Think there's any chance applying this to coin hero skins? Iksar says it's on the backlog of things to do, but we've had to table most of those things while the team focuses on getting Mercenaries released. I want Mercenaries released, don't get me wrong, but I also really want the random hero skin option. It's just they're adding so many cosmetics to the game, and it's laborious to have to go in and like switch your hero portrait for any given deck or game if you want to see your different portraits that you've accrued. So having that random option where a different one shows up every game so you get a different experience, I think little stuff like that goes a long way towards making your purchases feel more rewarding, which would be great for Blizzard because they certainly want to make money and encourage people to buy these sorts of things. I also think it just makes the game feel more fun. You're kind of like, oh, which hero did I get this time? And you get a little bit of different voice lines, and you're not seeing the same repetitive stuff over and over and over again. So a couple reasons I think this would go a long way. So I hope it is something that's on the top of the priority list once Mercenaries gets out and settled, because I really, really want this one personally. This is pretty wild. Chances of other universes coming to Hearthstone in light of Magic the Gathering having a ton of other universes popping up into its cards lately. Iksar says we'd have to create a product that made sense for it, probably a purely cosmetic one that has alternate card art for existing cards. Are we open to it though? We've had some very initial discussion with other IP holders to see if there is interest in collaboration. What anime should we do? And he lists here some of his top options for, I guess, specifically Japanese IPs that might be fitting for Hearthstone. Listen, I'm not a huge fan of this. Like, Hearthstone takes spins on this, and I think that's pretty welcome. Harrison Jones is obviously a reference to Indiana Jones / Harrison Ford, and League of Explorers is clearly pretty thematically connected to those sorts of things, right? I like that existing within the Hearthstone universe. I wouldn't be a big fan if, like, Chun-Li, for instance, just popped into Hearthstone. That would feel immersion breaking for me. I know there's not a lot of immersion in Hearthstone. I wouldn't buy into the hype of that. I'm already engaged in the game, but I do think it's possible that gets other people excited in Hearthstone, which ultimately is good for me and good for the player base. So I would absolutely tank this hit if Hearthstone decided it was right for the game to add in other properties and other sorts of famous characters. I probably would have to kind of begrudge when I saw them in the game, but if it's good for the game, if it's good for the player base, if people want it, I'll put my own personal biases aside here and take that L. So this one's pretty interesting about economy, essentially. Would you ever make an expansion completely available for one payment? Iksar says probably not for the latest expansion, though we've discussed this idea for non-latest expansions. So I'm interpreting that to mean like when a new expansion comes out, you'd have to get packs for that one, but any previous expansion at that point would become available for a one-time purchase. Who knows what the price would be, but you spend $100 or something and you get an old expansion, all of its cards, and you don't have to open packs. Now, I've clearly welcomed this idea of one-time purchases, but if it's not for the latest expansion, I don't know that it really solves the problem, because most people are still going to want to get the newest cards. It would only really help in these specific instances of people returning to the game, or maybe brand new players trying to catch up really quickly, which, I mean, that's great. That's a bonus. It's better than what we have now. If you want to go back and you want to buy all of Forged in the Barrens because you started the game today, or you're returning to the game today, cool, that's great. But I think we really need it for the latest expansion as well, even if it comes at a slight premium. I know Blizzard doesn't want to lose their pack model, but I feel like you could make the pack model more cosmetically driven and then just sell people expansions outright. It would really go a long way for the affordability of Hearthstone. And I think it would feel better too, because everybody would have access to the new stuff. They'd be way more excited to play. So to me, this solves a few problems, but clearly Blizzard wants their cash on this one. This is probably a fight we're never really going to win, but we can still ask for it. So this next one is going to take a little bit more discussion, so I wanted to save it for last. This is a question about persistent effects, basically quest rewards like Mage or Warlock, with these long-term game-altering effects that often just outright win games, reminiscent a bit to Crystal Core, the old Rogue quest, as mentioned here in the question. And just basically, would you agree there are similarities between these sorts of effects? And talking about the inevitability in control matchups, Iksar says there are definitely upsides and downsides. Having direct objectives for a deck makes building that deck distinctly different than other decks before it. However, if you pay a steep cost in deck construction, you should be rewarded appropriately. Appropriate rewards for steep deck building costs need to be quite large. So large, they're usually game ending. I don't think this means these styles of decks should never exist, but there is a reason we don't do quests with huge rewards every expansion. So some interesting, some takes here. Basically, Iksar kind of, as I'm reading this, says, there's a balance here. We don't want too much of this. It needs to have risk and reward and payoff, all of which are sentiments that I agree with. I would argue right now, though, that I don't think Mage or Warlock in particular have had steep deck building costs. Now, this may just be a vocabulary difference, but I would say they have narrow deck building costs. In other words, yes, you have to build the deck in a specific way, but it has proved to be a way that is not particularly risky or demanding. So I wouldn't personally call it steep. In other words, the deck's working just fine. It's doing its thing. Both of the decks are actually sometimes very capable of winning even without proccing their quest reward. So it's not like you're having to run bad cards or non-synergistic cards. The cards are all still working together very well. Sometimes Quest Warlock just wins with Flesh Giants because Flesh Giants are so synergistic with what the deck is already doing. And sometimes Quest Mage just has the burn damage where they just pop you in the face. They don't even need to finish the quest sometimes. So the decks are narrowly designed, but you're not really sacrificing much. You're still playing cards that all work very, very well together. And then you just happen to have this end game state that's just like, okay, the cards were already awesome. Now they're just clearly game ending. The game just ends as soon as I get my quest reward done. And I think that's an important distinction, right? Like if you had to run bad cards or non-synergistic stuff to finish your quest, it makes more sense. I'm even probably going to use Quest Rogue here, the old Crystal Core Quest Rogue as an example. That deck had to run like a lot of weird one drops and a lot of weird bounce effects that weren't really very good often until you finish the quest. Like you were actually sacrificing a lot along the way. You're making these weird suboptimal turns, just bouncing stuff back to your hand or playing cards that probably wouldn't otherwise be great. And all of that was in service to getting the quest done. And then once the quest was done, clearly like you were off to the races, you win the game. But it felt like you were sacrificing up to that point. With the new quest lines, you're getting rewards along the way. You're playing cards you're pretty much happy to play anyway. It doesn't feel like you're making that sacrifice. So although that may have been the intent, I don't know that that has really been realized in quests. And maybe that's part of the reason they felt so oppressive so far for many, many players. I think there are other quests that do it better. Like I think Paladin's quest line, like you are actually having to do some kind of weird stuff that doesn't necessarily lead into your quest reward. Playing 1 mana stuff doesn't really feed into Silverhand recruits getting buffed. Like you can do it. It's more like the Rogue quest though, where you're kind of just doing something separate to get to this point. And there's an argument that that may feel less intuitive or less synergistic or fun even, but it also reaches the right balance where this long-term game-ending sort of effect comes at a sacrifice. And I don't have the answers on how to fix that or what could have been changed to make it feel that way. I just think for me there is a distinct difference there in those most recent versions of the quest and many other sort of things that have demanded very steep deck building requirements. Even if you go to Highlander, right? Like I think that has been a more steep deck building requirement than these quests. Having one ofs has proved to be sometimes a little more awkward. Like, clearly Highlander decks were still great. You did have to really fundamentally change how you looked at your deck, whereas with these quests, I don't know that you're changing it all that much. So anyway, curious to hear some thoughts on this one. Do you think it was steep? Do you think it was too easy? Share those takes down in the comments below. That said, I think we're done with this AMA recap. Always exciting to see what's in the minds of Hearthstone devs. I'm really excited for Mercenaries coming out this week. Man, next week's AMA might be a scorcher with Mercenaries information out there. I think we're going to get some Battlegrounds updates too. So it sounds like we might have a lot to talk about next week, so stay tuned for that one. In the meantime, of course, share your thoughts and comments down there below. Always curious to read those and get your takes. Keeps me closer to reality for what the player base is feeling and thinking, so that's always nice. Thanks a ton for watching, and until next time, game on.